if you scapegoat somebody and cast them out, if you push them out and sort of denigrate them as sort of almost subhuman, it makes the in-group feel more cohesive.
To get Brexit done.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hi, I'm Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Toby Young. Toby Young is a veteran journalist who was recently cancelled from one of his jobs, but he's also setting up something called a free speech union. So we're going to talk about why Toby Young has set up the free speech union and what cancel culture is and what it's like to be cancelled. What is a free speech union?
So the Free Speech Union is a mass membership organisation which exists to protect the speech rights of its members. My original thought was to set it up and limit the membership to academics, intellectuals, journalists, poets, novelists, comedians, anyone who makes a living from communicating ideas. But I've now decided to broaden the membership, so anyone who thinks their speech rights are under threat can join, or anyone who even just supports the cause can join. And the idea is to try and produce something to counter the sort of Maoist climate of intolerance which is sweeping through our institutions, particularly the mainstream media, universities, the public service, politics, whereby, there's so much now you can't say. And whenever someone says something which is mildly challenging, a little bit politically incorrect, they're at risk now of being cancelled. An outrage mob forms up on social media, people start condemning them on the airwaves, in TV studios, no one comes to their defence, open letters, petitions start circulating, and within a week they've lost their career, they can no longer make a living, they're unemployable for the next 2 or 3 years. It's a terrible trend. We're becoming less and less tolerant of dissent as a society. People are having to lower their voices, if they even challenge something like saying, if they even challenge the idea that trans women are women, you can't do that without lowering your voice now, unless you want to risk, being defenestrated, being cast out of polite society, even though 99% of people, would challenge that. So the Free Speech Union is going to try and protect people from being mobbed just for speaking their minds.
So, I join the union, I say something mildly controversial.
I wouldn't be surprised.
What happens next?
If your employer tries to put you through a disciplinary or complaints procedure, or worse, fires you, and you're a member of the union, then we will go to bat for you. We'll provide, if we think you've got a winnable case, we'll provide legal assistance. In some cases, we'll even indemnify your legal expenses. If necessary, we'll crowdfund so you can fight your case with good lawyers. If there's a mob baying for your blood on social media, a Twitchfork mob, we will try and organise a counter mob to defend you. If people are writing to your employer, urging your employer to fire you, we'll organise a campaign of people to write to your employer, urging them to keep a stiff backbone and not fire you. If there's a petition circulating, calling for you to be fired, we'll organise a counter petition. We'll do whatever we can to protect you.
Where do you draw the line? I mean, what happens if someone says something genuinely racist or homophobic or something that really is out of, polite society? Where do you draw the line?
I think if people say something racist or homophobic in the workplace, I think that it's perfectly acceptable, provided it really is racist or homophobic, and not something people are claiming is hate speech when it isn't. If it really is, if they use the N-word or something like that, or if they use the F-word to describe a gay person, and their employer says, sorry, that's against our internal policy, I think, that's up to the employer. I don't think we would step in and try and defend that particular person. If they were prosecuted, if there was an attempt to prosecute them for saying those words, then I think we'd look more closely at it. But I think the way in which the free speech debate is often framed, it's as though you're pitting, privileged white males against beleaguered minority groups. And when you make the argument for free speech, the narrative goes, you're just arguing for more space, even more space for these kind of gammons who are out there kind of blasting away in the public square and not letting anyone else speak. And that hurts minorities. And often these gammons are engaging in hate speech. So why would anyone want to protect their right to say hateful, offensive things? But actually, I think that's the wrong way of framing this discussion. Free speech isn't just for, privileged, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, Tory, Brexit-supporting males. It's for everybody. If it hadn't been for people exercising their right to free speech, we wouldn't have had the gay rights movement. We wouldn't have had, Martin Luther King organising civil rights protests in Washington. Free speech is for everyone, and it's particularly for beleaguered minorities. It isn't just something that exists to protect the privilege of, people like me. And I really want to get that across, that, it's not just for me, it's also for thee. And without it, we're all at risk, and we need to collectively do more to support it. And, the Free Speech Union won't be a right-wing conservative organisation. We won't take any political stances. We'll embrace people of all political persuasions and none. Quite often, liberals don't stand up for conservatives when their free speech rights are jeopardised. When Jacob Rees-Mogg is no platformed at the University of the West of England, you don't have a chorus of people on the left kind of clamouring to defend his free speech rights. But the fact is, in due course, it'll be their turn. They'll be threatened with being no platform, and that's beginning to happen. People like Germaine Greer, Julie Bindel, even Peter Tatchell, the gay rights campaigner, because he challenged transgender orthodoxy, the trans-Taliban went after him, and now he's being no platformed. His speech rights are in jeopardy. So, you sort of think of it like, first they came for me and, Germaine Greer said nothing. But that was silly, because sooner or later they'll be coming for the Liberals too. So it's in everyone's interest to stand up for free speech.
We'll get onto sort of cancel culture in a minute, which is absolutely fascinating. I know that you've been a sort of victim, as it were, of that. But I'm really interested in this kind of idea of a free speech union, because many people might say that there are a few flaws in this. Who makes the decision as to whether speech is acceptable or not? You just came up with an example there. If they say the N-word, that's pretty obvious, but some of these cases are pretty nuanced. Who is it that's making those decisions as to whether you should defend them at work or not?
The Free Speech Union has a board of directors that includes the author and journalist Douglas Murray, Professor Nigel Biggar, a professor at Oxford University, and we also have an advisory council which includes lots of distinguished, eminent professors and intellectuals, people like Matt Ridley, David Starkey, lots of great people, and we will be, before deciding whether to go into bat for someone, I'll be consulting those people, and it'll be, a collective decision. But I think the issue you put your finger on is actually a problem for those who would suppress free speech. The question is, who's going to decide people who campaign against hate speech, for instance, the difficulty they have is who gets to decide what's hate speech and what isn't. Okay, sometimes it's really obvious and we all know it when we see it, but often it's actually it's a very grey area. Is challenging the idea that a trans woman is a woman? Is that hate speech? Well, according to some members of the trans-Taliban, it is. According to gender-critical professors of philosophy, second-wave feminists, it isn't hate speech. It's a perfectly legitimate point of view and something that we should explore and discuss. So I think the difficulty you put your finger on is actually a difficulty for the opponents of free speech. Who can we trust to make those kinds of decisions? And the issue is, I think, if it's against the law, if something you say is a direct incitement to violence, if you go up to a black person in a shopping centre and scream the N-word in their face, then that is a direct incitement to violence. That should be unlawful. But I think where I would draw the line is the same place that the framers of the First Amendment of the American Constitution would draw the line, which is everything's acceptable within the law, provided it's not a direct incitement to violence. Often people who are opponents of free speech claim that the speech they want to censor is an incitement to violence. So people would object to Boris Johnson saying, comparing burqa-wearing women to letterboxes on the grounds that that's an incitement to violence. People reading that joke, on reading it, would go out and attack burqa-wearing women. Well, the evidence that that actually happened is extremely threadbare. So it's not enough to say that what someone's written or said, some inappropriate remark or joke they've made, could lead to violence under certain circumstances. If, someone who's a bit mentally unstable hears the gag in question, that's not enough. You have to be able to show that someone saying this would directly lead, imminently, to violence. And I think if you can show that, fair enough, you can prohibit the speech from being uttered. But if you can't, I think, under the law anyway, anything should go.
Is Tommy Robinson in your free speech union? Would you allow him to come in?
Well, Tommy Robinson hasn't applied to be in my union yet. And I think that would be, again, a decision for the board and the advisory council rather than a decision for me. But I would say that he's welcome to become a member of the union. We have a statement of values, and we encourage our members not to criticise people in the course of making an argument for their membership of various groups. So not to criticise them because they're a member of a particular ethnic group or a particular religious group, or because they happen to be a woman, or even because they happen to be a man. Provided he'd be willing to sign up to that statement of values, then yeah, I think we'd let him in.
So don't be racist, don't be sexist, basically.
Yeah, but do
you think he has been? Do you think he's said those comments in the past?
I think some of the comments he's made about Muslims cross the line.
Which ones?
He's I couldn't pull anything out of my hat, but the implication is that I think in the past he has strongly implied that there is a direct causal link between being a Muslim and being a member of a grooming gang. That's the context in which you have to understand those terrible crimes. And I don't think that's right. And I think that borders on Islamophobia.
What's cancel culture?
Cancel culture is something that's happened. Cancel culture, I think, has been with us for probably as long as humans have tried to cooperate together in society. Some people are going to offend against sacred values and they're going to be cast out. But it's really become a problem, I think, in the past decade or so as a result of the internet, the social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, the ease with which people can start online petitions, create and circulate open letters, targeting certain individuals, the way in which you can use platforms like Twitter to accumulate evidence of someone's misdeeds in the past and then circulate them in the present in order to try and discredit them or to show that they are beyond the pale. So cancel culture, I think, has really become a problem in the past 10 years or so, and it seems to be getting worse and worse. And the curious thing is, it doesn't matter how often right of centre candidates win elections. In the cultural arena, there is this kind of march further and further towards the left. And that means that the Overton window, the window of what you can acceptably say without being judged beyond the pale, without being thought to be an unfit person to kind of participate in the public square, that's getting narrower and narrower, and it's shifting further and further leftwards. And that's why I think an organisation like mine, even though it will be a non-partisan organisation, is so important. We've got to try and do something to position that Overton window more to the centre and to make it a little bit less narrow. So there's just more people can say. They're allowed to speak their minds. They're allowed to speak up and say what they think about a range of really important issues without risking being judged, a bigot a homophobe, a racist, or whatever it might be. You can be against open borders, for instance, without being a bigot or a racist. You can be pro-Brexit without being a Little Englander or a xenophobe. I mean, so often the quality of discourse in our public square is poisoned by people, particularly people on the left, being too willing to hurl around these smears. It's not actually engaging in an argument. It's trying to shame people into shutting up by calling them these dangerous, toxic words. And we want to try and stop that. We want to try and make our society a little bit more tolerant. So people who do have something to say and who want to debate these important issues can do so without fear of being smeared or cast out.
Can you just explain to viewers what your experience was with cancel culture? I mean, you got cancelled, didn't you?
I have been cancelled myself, yeah. So I started, helped to start 4 free schools, was on the board of a couple of education charities, and in 2018, the last government created a new higher education regulator called the Office for Students, and Theresa May appointed me as one of 15 non-executive directors to sit on the board of this new regulator. And it was announced on the 1st of January, and within 24 hours I was trending on Twitter because all these offence archaeologists had started sifting through everything I'd ever said or written, dating back in one case to 1987 in my kind of 30-plus year career as a journalist, to try and find evidence that I was an unfit person, to serve on this public body. I mean, the weird thing about offence archaeologists is, if they think that something you've said 30-odd years ago is offensive and is likely to really upset people, why would you then kind of rebroadcast it in the present? I mean, what are you hoping to upset, a ton of more people? It was like the kind of anti-racist campaigners at the general election in December, campaigning against Boris on the grounds that he'd used the expression bum boys to describe gay men, and he'd compared Muslim women to letterboxes when they were in the full burqa. It was like they were claiming that these phrases, these jokes are completely unacceptable in public life because they will trigger people to commit hate crimes. But they were then repeating them over and over again on television. It's like, if you really think if you sincerely believe that just hearing Boris's burqa gag is going to cause some people to go out and start terrorising Muslims on our high street, then why would you repeat it over and over and over again in every TV studio and on every radio station in the country? It's just bonkers. But anyway, that's offence archaeology, and they went to town on me and they found various things I'd written and said. They found someone went through all the pieces I'd ever written for The Spectator. I've been a columnist for The Spectator for more than 20 years, and found a piece I'd written in which I'd praised this late night programme on this obscure cable channel called Men and Motors, in which page 3 girls sort of draped themselves over fast cars, and I'd praised this programme, saying it was my favourite late night viewing. This was in 2001. Even at the time, it was 17 years ago. Now 20 years ago, 19 years ago, and someone found that article, and the sub-editor at The Spectator had put at the top of it, "Confessions of a Porn Addict." His idea of a joke at the time. I thought it was quite funny. But someone found this article, screen grabbed it, stuck the screen grab on Twitter, and literally within half an hour, headline on the Evening Standard, new pressure mounts on Theresa May as university czar confesses to being porn addict. As if I'd confessed in the previous 24 hours to being a porn addict. So I was a totally unsuitable person to regulate universities. It was, endless stuff like that. And, a petition was got up and it had 220,000 signatures. There
was some tweets as well from, was it 10 years ago you wrote some tweets?
There was some unsuitable tweets, sophomoric stuff about boobs, stuff I'd tweeted late at night while watching things like the Oscars. I mean, it was not the best jokes I've ever made, not my finest hour. But one of the things that is so awful about cancel culture is that people are judged for their worst moments. You know, people take the worst things they've ever tweeted and say, look at this, you know, this guy is a totally awful, evil person. This is the kind of thing he said. So nothing about the fact that I'd set up, you know, 4 schools in one of the most deprived wards in London, served as a Fulbright commissioner where I'd helped kids from disadvantaged backgrounds get scholarships to American universities, you know, served on a number of education charities, gone on a tour of 6th forms in the most disadvantaged parts of the country, trying to persuade kids to apply to Oxford and Cambridge and Russell Group universities. None of that mattered. I was a villain because I'd tweeted 3 or 4 times about somebody's boobs 10 years ago. So therefore, you know, forget everything else I've ever done, forget everything I've achieved, that rules me out. It's that's cancel culture for you. And if an organisation like the Free Speech Union had been around 2 years ago when this happened to me, I hope it would have stood up for me.
I want to sort of understand what that experience was like, because I can just imagine someone going through something on Facebook I wrote 20 or 10 years ago, and
nobody's safe, I think. You know,
yeah, and then getting sacked from my
Twitter
job.
Or Facebook
It's pretty scary. So what was it like? Did your friends back? I know, did your friends back you? Did some of them not back you? Did you sort of find out who your real friends were at the time?
Yeah, the Louis C.K., who was cancelled at around the same time, he has this gag that it's true that you find out who your real friends are, but it's not the people that you wanted your real friends to be, it's the other lot, you know. That wasn't the case with me. You do find out who your real friends are because not everyone sticks by you. But in my case, most of my friends did, and that was extremely gratifying. Some people didn't, but they were mostly, you know, colleagues, people I'd worked with, people I'd known on and off and would kind of say hello to at parties, but not my closest friends. But, you know, it's still disappointing when they join the mob, when they pile on. I think it's, you know, you nonetheless feel quite isolated even when your friends are, for the most part, sticking up for you. Some people who've been through it have found it really traumatizing. There was a guy, the New York Times ran a story a couple of months ago about the head of a department at Dartmouth. A group of graduate students in his department had complained about sexual harassment, and he tried to do something about it. He'd referred the complaint to the Title IX office at Dartmouth, which is the correct procedure, and about 18 months later they then sued Dartmouth for $70 million, and part of their suit was the claim that they'd flagged up this sexual harassment to this guy and he hadn't done enough about it. And therefore Dartmouth had acted negligently, hadn't protected them from sexual harassment within this guy's department. And actually he had done what was required of him, and they hadn't flagged up the seriousness of their complaints when they'd first flagged them with him. So, you know, it wasn't as though he felt he needed to do more, because he didn't think it was as serious as it turned out to be. One of the allegations was of rape, but it wasn't when they first complained to him. That only came up 18 months later when they were suing for $70 million. He had suffered a mental breakdown 20 years earlier. But he had rebuilt his life, he was married, he had, I think, 2 young children, and, you know, was a successful academic. But the mob duly formed up on Twitter. People started tweeting about him using the hashtag #MeToo and Time's Up. People in his department wouldn't speak to him. A woman in a supermarket told him she thought he was scum. And he found it so overwhelming, so isolating and unpleasant that he took his own life towards the end of last year. And he's not the first person to take his own life as a result of having been mobbed, having been cancelled in this way. Somebody else, a video game designer, the creator of a guy called The Cabin in the Woods, I think, he was Me Too'd by a pretty unreliable person last year, and he ended up committing suicide. Someone in South Korea ended up committing suicide when they were cancelled. So, you know, you are playing with fire when you go after people in this way. And I think people on Twitter, on Facebook, people who sign these petitions and open letters, because it's a mob, because there are so many people participating in this kind of frenzied witch hunt, they don't take any individual responsibility. They're just one of thousands, in some cases 10,000 people participating. So they don't feel that they're really doing anything particularly awful. But actually the cumulative impact on people can be really devastating.
And it really is a modern day witch hunt, isn't it? I mean, you send one tweet out, or they find some silly thing that you've written that isn't, most people would probably agree with, and then suddenly you've got thousands of people on Twitter piling in on you. But at the same time, it isn't the majority of people in the world piling in on you, is it? It's just a very sort of vocal minority. What is it behind this kind of the ethos of these people who just want to be offended by everything? They want to go and attack. Why do they want to cancel you? I mean, what effect does it have on them, you being on the board of this sort of government advisory on, to do with schools? It's got nothing. It has no effect on them.
I think it's. I think in my case, it was partly because I'd been appointed by Theresa May. So if they could force me to resign, or force her to fire me, that would be politically embarrassing. So they'd score some political points, and 99% of the people mobbing me were on the left. So there was a political motivation, and often I think that plays a part. I think psychologically, the reason people engage in witch hunts dating back to Salem, Massachusetts, is that if you scapegoat somebody and cast them out, if you push them out and sort of denigrate them as sort of almost subhuman, it makes the in-group feel more cohesive. It gives them a sense of belonging and community, which they wouldn't have if they can't occasionally kind of cast people out for offending against their values. It's a way of strengthening and underlining what they believe in. I think in many cases with hashtag activism, it was something Obama spoke out against a few months ago. Hashtag activism, activism, political activism, if you want to actually bring about political change, that's hard work, that's really tough. You have to be really committed, you have to go to a lot of late night meetings, you have to go out on demonstrations, you have to participate in sit-ins, whatever it takes to get the change you want to get done. In some cases, people risking arrest or worse during the civil rights protests in the 1960s. People were beaten up, some cases people were killed for standing up for the rights of minorities. So it's really hard work. Being a hashtag activist, on the other hand, isn't hard work. It's incredibly easy. All you have to do is write 240 characters on Twitter, add the hashtag and send it, and you feel like you've made a difference. Now, they're not really making a difference. They're not really bringing about any social change. But if they can occasionally get people fired, if they can occasionally make people unemployable as a result of their mobbing, then they feel like they're achieving something. It's not all worthless, At least they're achieving some little bit of change in their little digital arena. But it's pathetic.
Where does this lead to? Because it's pretty dangerous, isn't it?
It is quite dangerous, yes. I mean, it's exactly the same impulse that's behind, curiously enough, some of the things that the people who engage in this activity are most opposed to. What do they think the roots of homophobia or racism, or transphobia, where do they think the psychological roots of those feelings come from? It's wanting to exclude people from the in-group. It's wanting to other people, to push people out in order to create a greater sense of community and cohesion within the in-group. That's where hatred and prejudice and all these isms come from. So to see them engaging in precisely the same behaviour with the same psychological root is really disturbing.
I mean, in Britain, where we don't have a First Amendment, you've even had the police knocking at people's doors because of so-called transphobic tweets. I mean, I'm not saying we're getting there, but I can kind of understand the similarities and differences between the systems. But what is interesting in terms of similarities between some of the historical events that you've talked about is that you've got the prevailing ideology. Let's say in communism, it was the state that controlled, everything, and that view is sacred and no one can speak out against that. And today we've got this kind of woke culture. We've got this mainstream media who, in many ways, some would argue, have a pretty sort of similar view on most things, whether that's politically or culturally or whatever. And when you get dissenters like yourself or comedians or whoever who might say something different to that, those people mob and they try and get rid of you. So what are the similarities between those systems? Is it to do with sort of people basically being in their ideological trenches? I
think a lot of it is a kind of political tribalism. And one of the reasons I think that we're so susceptible to what is a kind of crowdsourced, social media-driven quasi-religion almost. They take it beyond just kind of believing in progressive orthodoxy and regard themselves as sort of moral crusaders, kind of, bug-eyed with a sense of kind of mission and purpose. One of the reasons I think people are susceptible to that kind of tribalism, and we see it on the left and the right, but it's kind of more prevalent on the left, at least in the United Kingdom at the moment. One of the reasons I think we see it so often is because other sources of community and belonging have broken down. The family isn't as important as it was. The church occupies nothing like the central position it did in the British public square that it used to. So as these other sources of community, belonging, meaning, as their influence wanes, so these other more toxic forces come in to fill the vacuum. And I think that's what we see. I mean, you saw it last year, a really unpleasant episode with Sir Roger Scruton, the Conservative philosopher who had been appointed to this government commission called Building Better, Building Beautiful. And it was a commission that had been appointed by, I think, the Department for Communities and Local Government to try and find out ways in which we could make public housing more attractive. And he'd written, numerous books on aesthetics, on architecture, as well as on conservative politics. And a journalist took him out to lunch. A journalist he had good reason to think would be fair-minded and decent, because it was from a magazine that he had written a column for a few years before, and interviewed him. And then after the interview, took various things he'd said out of context, dug up some of the more inflammatory things he'd said in the past, and took them out of context, and painted this picture of Sir Roger Scruton as this kind of frothing at the mouth, kind of bug-eyed homophobe and anti-Semite, which was wildly inaccurate, bore no relation to the truth. It was all created by twisting what he'd said, both in this interview and in the past, by this sort of mischievous journalist. And within even before the interview itself was published in the magazine, the journalist just put a few choice quotes on Twitter. Roger Scruton had been tossed under a bus by the government, and that was by a Conservative government. And it took Douglas Murray, one of the directors of the Free Speech Union, and others. I played a small part, but journalists kind of looked at the way in which these things he'd said had been taken out of context. Douglas got hold of the full transcript of the interview and discovered just how his words had been twisted and distorted, was able to print the transcript of that interview, and eventually, after several months, the magazine in question issued an apology. They didn't actually sack the journalist, but he got demoted, and eventually he was reinstated to this government body. But to see a man like that, that was in the last year of his life. He was 75 and had devoted his life to education. In the 1970s and 80s, he worked behind the Iron Curtain to set up a kind of underground university, so dissidents in places like Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia could have access to the books that were banned in their countries. He'd risked his liberty in order to provide an education to people behind the Iron Curtain in extremely dangerous circumstances. He's been, showered with honours by Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia now. But to see a man like that, a man as distinguished as that, torn limb from limb by the digital mob, it was just awful. And in the last year of his life, shortly after he just about managed to put this episode behind him, he was diagnosed with cancer and died about 3 months later. Just awful.
Does this come from a kind of uniformity of views in universities where students aren't being taught all sides, aren't being taught about all the different arguments, aren't being, rigorously challenged in their sort of intellectual beliefs? Is that where it comes from?
I think it does come from that. I think a lot of it comes from that. I think you would expect universities to be places where expressing a dissenting point of view is tolerated. pursuing a line of research which is controversial is tolerated. Encouraged. That's what universities are for, after all. If Charles Darwin had been treated like some of these gender-critical feminists are being treated by the trans Taliban, he never would have been able to come up with the origin of the species when he was a student at Cambridge. And I think one of the reasons campuses have become places of such ideological conformity in the past 10, 15 years is because fewer and fewer conservatives are being hired to work at universities. I mean, it used to be that in the humanities and the social sciences, Labour voters outnumbered Conservative voters by about 3 to 1 in the 1960s. That was always the case. Most intellectuals, not all, but most were left-wing. So there was about a 3 to 1 ratio. But now, if you look at if you look at surveys of how university employees voted in the 2019 general election, something like 90% voted for left of centre parties, whether it was the Labour Party, the SNP, the Greens, the Lib Dems, and fewer than 10% voted for the Conservative Party. So now, left of centre academics outnumber right of centre academics by a ratio of 9 to 1, and that creates a really oppressive atmosphere on campus for anyone who feels inclined to challenge progressive orthodoxy. I recently participated in a debate at Durham University, and I think Durham isn't as bad as some. I think something like 20% of the students at Durham vote Conservative instead of 10%, which is the national average. And I participated in this debate, and I was defending Boris Johnson. It was in the middle of the general election campaign, so temperatures were running pretty high. But the woman on the other side, who was a Momentum activist, she called me a homophobe, a misogynist. Some guy in the audience, who turned out to be the co-chair of the Durham Labour Club, got up, and because I'd written something in The Spectator saying that one of Prince Andrew's problems, this was just after he'd appeared on Newsnight and had the train wreck interview with Emily Maitlis. I said in this piece in The Spectator one of his problems was that he didn't have a tough wife able to advise him not to do things like go and be interviewed by Emily Maitlis on Newsnight, which turned out to be a PR disaster. And when Emily Maitlis wanted to interview me back at the beginning of 2018 when I was getting mobbed, I was inclined to do it. She kept texting me saying, come on to Newsnight. I was going to do it. My wife said, no, that would be a big mistake. And she was right. And I said in this piece of The Spectator, if only Prince Andrew had a tough, no-nonsense, sensible wife like mine, he might not have got into this particular difficulty. This guy who was the co-president of the Durham Labour Club, on the basis of me having written that piece, said, oh, so you're a paedophile, accused me of being a pedo. In this debate, it was supposed to be a grown-up debate in civilised circumstances, in one of the oldest debating societies, in one of Britain's most distinguished Russell Group universities. And the worst thing was, I'd taken my 11-year-old son Charlie with me to this debate because we were going to go and see Derby QPR. We're QPR fans, and QPR were playing Derby at Pride Park the following day, so we were going to drive home via Derby. And there was my 11-year-old son, seeing me being called a misogynist, a homophobe, and now a pedo by a Labour activist in this debating chamber. And I put Charlie to bed afterwards back at the hotel, went to the Union bar, and I said to this Labour activist, I said, didn't you have at least some inhibitions about calling me a child rapist in front of my 11-year-old son? I mean, I'm not. It's a smear. But there's a limit to what you can say about someone in front of their young children, isn't there? In a public forum, in a respectable environment like this. He said, no, you're a Tory tosser. Anything goes. And then this other guy came up to me in the bar, and I thought, oh no, another dose of kind of unpleasantness. He turned out to be really nice, polite, diffident. He was a Conservative. He told me about how his first year at Durham had been absolutely ruined because some Labour activists on campus had got hold of some things he'd said on some forum that was designed for freshers before they actually arrived at Durham. He'd said some mildly conservative things. He was a Catholic, so he'd raised questions about whether priests should be forced to marry gay couples in Catholic churches. So now he was a homophobe and a bigot. He'd expressed some sympathy for the state of Israel, so he was being criticised. Now he was in favour of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, apparently. And not only was he kind of abused wherever he went thereafter on campus, the woman who'd been appointed as his mother which is like a second year or third year student that the university appoints to look after you in your first couple of weeks. She accused him of being a bigot. She persuaded a gay friend of hers to make a pass at him in some cack-handed attempt to expose his bigotry. And she was supposed to be, mentoring him. She was supposed to be this kind of pastoral kind of carer. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Someone slapped him in the face in the bar. A guy threw a plate at him in the college dining hall and hurled him to the ground just for the sin of being a Tory. And I thought to myself, I knew it was bad being a kind of white, conservative, heterosexual male on campus, but I didn't know it was quite that bad. But that is the treatment, I think. And he said, all his friends at other universities experiencing exactly the same thing. If you challenge progressive orthodoxy on campus now, if you even challenge the idea that Corbyn is the second coming, you're liable to be slapped in the face, have plates thrown at you, hurled to the ground, insulted wherever you go, ostracised. That's the kind of atmosphere on campus. And these are, universities. This kid, first kid in his family to go to university, he was paying, 27 grand in tuition fees alone for the privilege of having abuse hurled at him by these kind of so-called social justice activists. I mean, it was just unspeakable. Universities like Durham need to be doing more to protect people like that. And I hope that, in future, if someone like that is a member of the Free Speech Union, we'll be able to bring pressure to bear on institutions like Durham to make sure people who have the temerity to express themselves and who don't necessarily conform to the dogma on campus aren't singled out and persecuted like that.
So you've obviously talked about universities there, a great example of where free speech is under threat. Can you talk to viewers about the Maya Forstater case? And if she was part of your Free Speech Union, what may have been different or how you could have helped her?
So I think the Maya Forstater case is, she is a tax advisor and worked for a charity which offered disadvantaged people tax advice, I think some refugees as I understand it. And she on Twitter, and I think in her office workplace, had challenged the idea that trans women are women. And I think in one instance she had refused to use a particular individual's preferred gender pronoun. And that's compelled speech. When someone says, my preferred gender pronoun is Z, or G, whatever it might be, you can't persecute people for not using that. Of course, if they want to be polite, then they should use it, but they shouldn't have to use it for fear of losing their jobs. Anyway, so she was fired for supposedly being transphobic and for trafficking in hate speech on social media and in her workplace. And she brought a case in an employment tribunal against her employer. And she claimed that under the 2010 Equality Act, just as certain religions and certain political points of view are protected speech, so you can't be persecuted, you can't be fired for expressing the views that you believe in. The judge ruled that her view, which is that there are only two genders and that there is a biological architecture underpinning gender, and that sex, not gender but sex, has a biological reality which is difficult to get around. That point of view, the judge ruled, was not something that deserved protection. No, on the contrary, it was bigoted, it was hateful, it was violating the human rights of her transgendered co-workers. So it was perfectly fine that she'd been fired, which is just extraordinary. And she's now decided to appeal that ruling, and I hope she wins on appeal. If she had been a member of the Free Speech Union, then we certainly would have gone to bat for her. We would have helped her crowdfund to pay all her legal expenses, would have tried to find her really good lawyers to fight her corner. Interestingly, she's done quite well crowdfunding in her own right, and done particularly well since J.K. Rowling on Twitter backed her. Now, the extraordinary thing about that is, J.K. Rowling, she said this woman effectively shouldn't have been fired. There are room for different points of view in any workplace, particularly on something as contentious and, as this, which we're still having a national conversation about. And we still haven't really decided all these kind of issues around transgender identity. There's still a consultation going on, as far as I know, about the Gender Recognition Act, and whether people can just self-identify as a different gender, or they have to have lived as that particular gender for a year before they can legally change their gender, and so forth. So it's a national conversation. Why shouldn't someone be able to express their point of view and participate in this conversation, even if it runs afoul of the trans Taliban? So that's pretty much what J.K. Rowling said on Twitter. People are being now disciplined, subject to complaints procedures, merely for liking that tweet by J.K. Rowling. I mean, librarians, the length and breadth of America, were burning Harry Potter books as a consequence of her saying this. Unbelievable kind of reaction by kind of the social justice left to this perfectly reasonable point of view being expressed by one of their own. I mean, she's a left-winger. She gives money to the Labour Party. She's pals with Gordon Brown, yet, that doesn't protect her. And there was one particular example, a social worker, I think, retweeted this particular tweet of J.K. Rowling's, and as a consequence, someone complained to his employer, and he is now being investigated by Social Work England, which is the regulatory body which regulates social workers. I mean, it's just extraordinary. It is like Salem, in the 17th century. It's bizarre.
Okay, so finally, what is the solution to this? How do we get past this cancel culture? How do we stop this from happening?
Well, I think there are some encouraging signs. I've set up this free speech union. Lots of really good people have contacted me and said, how can I help? And I've recruited some of them to the board and to the advisory council, to the legal advisory council, the PR and media advisory council. So we now have kind of an army of people ready to go in and protect people who find themselves being persecuted and singled out in this way, just for challenging, the prevailing orthodoxy in their workplace, or whatever it might be. But there are other, encouraging signs. So Ricky Gervais's monologue at the Golden Globes this year, in which, he took aim at some of these kind of woke shibboleths. People absolutely loved it. That was retweeted, replayed hundreds of thousands of times on social media and on YouTube. Another example, Lawrence Fox on Question Time. In my view, didn't say anything, racist or homophobic, nothing that was beyond the pale or which should have resulted in him being unemployable as an actor. The audience, they lapped it up. And afterwards, he became a kind of anti-woke anti-hero. I mean, he kind of blotted his copybook when it emerged that he had made some imprudent remarks about the casting of a Sikh in one scene in 1917, the new Sam Mendes film about the First World War. But, for the most part, the reaction to him saying what he said on Question Time and challenging, some of these ridiculous ideas, like the concept of white privilege, the reaction was incredibly positive. He got overwhelming support, in all the articles written about him. If you looked at the comments below, there were just kind of, 99% of them were from people saying, finally, someone had the courage to actually speak out against these commissars of political correctness. So I think there are some encouraging signs. I mean, I think with the right will, with the right degree of organisation, if we hang together and we organise, then I think we can turn it around and push back this new cultural revolution.
Toby Young, thank you very much.
Thank you.